Okay. Hi, I am so happy to be here tonight with Ammar Kalia and Susie Luo, who are two of our debut authors, whose books have just come out slash are just about to come out. Um, Before we get started, I'm just going to quickly alert you to the fact that this event is being recorded purely for the purpose of us being able to use little snippets on our social media. Um, and also just a reminder that everyone's cameras should be off and everyone should be on mute except for myself and Susie and Ammar. Um, and yeah, just before we begin as well, I'm going to let you know the structure. So I am going to introduce Susie and Ammar's books more formally than I have already, and then they're going to tell you a bit about them and do a reading, and then I have some questions for them, and then later in the event we are going to take some questions from the chat. So throughout, um, as I'm speaking, you can put your questions in the chat, and then about halfway through, I'll start asking questions from there, and um, right up till the end. And then at the very end, Susie and Ammar will choose their favourite question, and whoever that is will win a copy of each book. So that giveaway is UK only as well, by the way. But I will remind you of that later on. But yeah, first, I'm going to just get started and introduce Susie's book. Susie is the author of Paper Names, and it's her debut novel, which she wrote at night while she was working as an investment banker by day. It is a sweeping story about a family who move from China to New York, and it's told across 3 decades in a non-linear narrative, and it really kind of it explores the impact of migration on their family dynamic, and also the search, each character's individual search for the American dream. Um, I first read the book, I think I remember vividly reading it in Christmas, I think Christmas 2022. And I was immediately drawn in, and I think I read it in a single sitting, just immediately drawn in by the character, the way the characters were portrayed, the unflinching emotional honesty at the heart of all their relationships, particularly a father and daughter relationship that forms the heart of the narrative. And um, for me, that just kept me reading. And I found the ending of the novel so moving in a way that is not, I don't normally have like a physical emotional response when I'm reading, but I found myself tearing up at the end of the novel, and I just knew immediately that we had to get it for Verve. But I'll stop babbling and I'll let Susie introduce her own book and give you a short reading. I feel like, yeah, I will need to unmute her.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to the event. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Jenna. I guess just a little more on top of what she said before I get into the reading is, like Jenna said, Paper Names at the heart of it is a story about identity, family, and immigration. And through the novel, we follow the lives of three New Yorkers over the course of 2 to 3 decades. So there is Oliver, who is a handsome white lawyer who lives in a exclusive, wealthy building on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. His doorman, Tony, who's a Chinese immigrant and who was an engineer when he was in China, and his daughter, Tammy, who kind of has to struggle between balancing her more modern American upbringing with the expectations of her immigrant parents. So, at the beginning of the novel, an unexpected attack happens that intertwines the lives of these three characters together. And then over the years, we follow them as they make decisions that both show us who they are and who they want to be. So, the excerpt I'm going to read is from the first chapter. Not the very beginning, but somewhere in the middle, where we follow Tony, the Chinese-born engineer turned doorman in New York City, and he's taking the subway to work, and he's taking it to the Rosewood, which is a luxury co-op on the Upper West Side. And just so you know, his wife's name is Kim. On the crowded subway, Tony itched his sweaty neckline and unbuttoned his cufflinks. The polyester wool blend suit grew tighter on him by the minute. Suddenly, the train jolted to a halt, wheels shrieking. The conductor garbled over the speakers about a signal malfunction, the first words of English that he'd heard that day. The other passengers checked their watches in a panic, muttering curses. Tony didn't worry. He always gave himself extra time to arrive anywhere, 30 minutes for work and school, an hour for Tammy's piano recitals, and 3 hours for any international flight. Being on time was simple, just plan ahead. He was always planning ahead. Above him, colorful subway advertisements ran along the walls. A narrow-necked bottle of sparkling water, designed for the bold since 1981. A flower delivery service, guaranteed to make your wife fall in love with you all over again. And an antidepressant that declared a new dawn. None of these ads appealed to Tony. Tap water served him just fine. Kim would kill him if he wasted money on roses, and he didn't have time to be depressed. Another banner with faded black lettering warned that skipping fares on the subway could result in an arrest or fine. That one made Tony pull his jacket snug on his shoulders. Above ground again, Tony checked his pant pocket for his wallet and felt a hard object lodged underneath it. A glass containing a dark horse powder and labeled Cat's Claw, immunity booster. Kim had purchased it on her weekly visit to the traditional medicine man on Casino Boulevard. Sprinkle some in your coffee, she told him as she unloaded the rest of her purchases onto their mattress. Valerian root and passion flower for sleeplessness, ginkgo and pennywort for brain boosters. Natural remedies are the secret to a long and healthy life, she said, as she gazed at her collection of tiny quart bottles. Her nonsense powders. It was her way of staying close to her occupation in China, a medical doctor whose practice had been solely grounded in science. During the early 90s, a wave of Chinese immigrants turned their backs on their old careers and descended upon the States as an army of software engineers. Anyone can quickly learn to speak in ones and zeros and single word functions and semicolons. Tony still didn't understand why Americans themselves didn't want such high-paying jobs. Kim guessed that it was too much work for too low of a profile. Regardless, they saw the opportunity and crawled through that hole to America. Neither of them regretted their decision, but it didn't mean it was easy to live with either. In China, they had had everything, but by way of a trusted grapevine, they learned that everything they had was better in America. In America, middle-class people could afford to live in single-family houses instead of cramped apartments. They didn't only have a washing machine for laundry, but a dryer and a dishwasher. Indoor heat was theirs to adjust, not controlled by a building's stingy landlord. Still, the most memorable comparison that I heard was that in China, they could only spring for cake with cream once a year. But in America, they could eat it every week. A block away from the Rosewood, an older gentleman in a three-piece suit cursed into his cell phone. The man growled, "I don't care if it's before 6 a.m. in Los Angeles. He works on my time." A woman with puffy eyes wiped her nose on the sleeve of an oversized sweatshirt, her face sallow, carved with a desperate loneliness. Tony shrank as he passed her. What a strange land, he discovered. He had witnessed children screeching profanities at their nannies, protesters marching with signs to arrest the nation's president. Americans had no shame, no commitment to public decorum. He admired them. They were fearless. They were real.
Amazing. Thank you, Susie. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Ammar's book now. Ammar is a journalist for The Guardian. He's their global music critic, and he's also a writer and a musician himself. A Person is a Prayer is his debut, which is being published by Oldcastle Books, which is Verve's sister company, in May. I think I first read A Person is a Prayer around about the same time as I read Paper Names for the first time. And like we work quite closely with the team of the Oldcastle. There's a lot of overlap. So I worked on the edit for A Person is a Prayer as well. And it's a really beautifully written novel about a family's migration from India and Kenya to the UK. But so this story, it unfolds across 6 decades, but the narrative itself only focuses in on 3 days, specific days within that frame of time. And I think like it's so clever in that within these 3 vignettes into this family's story, you get such a specific, like a sense of what's going on in the family at that specific moment within the narrative, but also a really clear sense of what has gone on in the intervening years between each day within the narrative. And yeah, so the book opens with a couple who are contemplating what their life is going to look like if they decide to get married and relocate to a different country. And then the rest of the novel basically shows you what that life ends up looking like. But it's not only their life, it then becomes the lives of their children and their grandchildren. And yeah, for me, what was the kind of most striking thing about Ammar's novel is the really impactful way it portrays how one person or one generation of a family, like their experiences and their story, then goes on to form like a bigger part of like a bigger family story and a family history. But yeah, I'm going to hand over to Ammar now, who will explain in more depth what the book is about and give you a short reading.
Thanks, Jenna. Can you hear me? Am I coming through all right? Yeah. That was great. Thank you. That's it. Done. But it's yeah, it's sort of set on one day in 1955, one day in 1994, and one day in 2019. And yeah, like you said, it's a snapshot of this one family's kind of existence over 3, 4 generations. It mirrors my own family. I'm from London, I was born here, but it mirrors my family's migratory kind of pattern as well, where they kind of were, born in India or Kenya and moved and then came to England. And yeah, and it's kind of, I was interested in the stories that we tell ourselves, the stories that we develop as people based on like what's passed down through our kind of family whisperings and how facts get changed. And ultimately, no one really knows the truth of what actually happened. So that was kind of the basis from which I guess I wrote this book. I'm going to read a bit from The Day in 1994, which is set in London, set in Hounslow, actually, which is where I grew up in West London. And it's from the perspective of the kind of patriarch, the father figure, who's called Bedi. You're on your own, at least for now, he thinks. He carefully ties his shoelaces, his London Underground standard issue steel-toed boots to last a lifetime. God, it was a good idea to retire. For once he'd done as his father had said and not worked a minute longer than his 50th birthday, even if he couldn't afford it. Now his days were just spent pottering around the house, the one they had managed to buy after arriving in Bournemouth and staying in a filthy bedsit for 9 months. After living with his brother and his miserable wife in London for 17 years, after his only son was born. Now he felt kind of free, actually. He wasn't really thinking of life at all. He was spending his time trying to erase the past, to eat as much as possible, and to just ruin the future generally. He was also busy playing dumb, not engaging in his grown kids' lives anymore, nor using his energy to distance himself from caring. Now his care had finally dissolved into a distant hum, something apart and something manageable. Everyone thinks that when he leaves the house each day, with no work to get to, that he spends his time at the pub, another man avoiding his responsibilities. But he is still deep in that responsibility, circling around it and kicking his way through. Every new step in this country is one he had never imagined. More often, he simply wants to catch himself in the murky building glass reflections as he walks, and every time he fails to recognize himself. He used to be smart, always in a suit and tie that would hang off his 6-foot frame, as if there was nothing his broad shoulders couldn't bear. Now he stoops in his itching black sweaters, his boots dragging along, thudding to remind him of each needless step, while his hair is long gone and his cartoonish pencil moustache grown out to a messy box around his slanted lips. This is what it must be to look like a real man, he thinks. None of the arrogance of suits and leather and collared shirts. Being a man, instead, is the obliteration of detail. Only the form remains, the flesh relegated to the same status as its cheap housing. Rough, uncared for, unadorned. Don't forget the semia, Shishma calls it him. She's making their absurdly pregnant daughter's favourite dessert tonight, ras malai. That sweet, sickly sludge of milk and sugar. Her first pregnancy was brutal. A 36-hour labour, a baby boy that kicked so hard he almost destroyed her bladder, and to top it off, brought on a bout of diabetes. The years spent after the birth weren't that easy either. Her boy, her firstborn, Aman, suffered from fits of epilepsy caused by his new body overheating. How he screamed at her for his pain. like he was trying to spit the words out before they could be formed, like he was blaming her for being born. And Sushma replied to these squills with food, days and days of it, knowing that everything would either be good or be forgotten with time. So the only thing left to do was to make sure the body was stable and strong. If the heart was unwilling, at least the legs could still carry the burden.
Thank you. Yeah, so hopefully those readings have given you a taste of what to expect from paper names and A Person is a Prayer. But yeah, now I'm gonna go on to the question portion of the evening. And yeah, okay, so I think what will be clear from the introductions is that both of your books unfold across several decades and have multiple main characters and track a family story of migration. But particularly with the narrative structure, like why did you choose to tell the stories in the way that you told them with the huge time span and the multiple narrators? I'm going to go to you first, Susie.
So I think in my book, it's kind of like a clashing between a white family, a white wealthy family, and a Chinese immigrant family. And I thought why it was interesting to play with different perspectives is you'll see how when Tony sees Oliver, the white lawyer, he sees Oliver as this like epitome of the American dream. You know, this like perfectly coiffed, like always knows what to say, guy who just like has it all. And then when you switch actually into Oliver, you see that's a great veneer that he's constructed. And you kind of see like beyond those layers. And I think we often do that to each other where like, especially, you know, with social media, it's like you see what people present, and you compare yourself to that. And in some ways, like through that kind of like internal competition, you can never really be happy. And you see kind of how like, as they start to get to know each other as people, how they come to regard each other differently and maybe reset their goals.
Yeah, and like also the non-linear side of things as well. I was particularly intrigued by like why did you decide to do it that way instead of in chronological order?
So I kind of wrote the book chapter by chapter. Sorry, that's my dog. Chapter by chapter, how it kind of comes out. And I think actually what happened was I didn't have any idea of like if it was going to be nonlinear or that it was even going to be three people or that some would be first person, some would be third person. I think I would just write until I kind of got bored of a character. And then I was like, okay, I just want to jump and switch to like a different character. Or like, I felt like if I wrote a certain chapter that I felt like there was a backstory for it, then I would just like kind of go back in time. So I kind of just try to do it intuitively. And I feel like I'm just glad it kind of came out in kind of like one string. So it kind of all like fit together.
Yeah, no, it definitely works really, it flows well as a story. And I'm always impressed by how that works when an author has kind of moved through time. But yeah, thank you. In Ammar, I already touched on your interesting structure. Why did you decide to focus in on the 3 days that you did focus in on?
Yeah, there's weirdly a lot of threes in this book. I think it all started because I had this idea of three siblings, like on the banks of the Ganges, like spreading their dad's ashes and having that one day told three times from each of their like first person perspectives, because I wanted to kind of trace how three people doing exactly the same thing could experience it obviously very differently and what we pick up from a life because of that. But I think then, yeah, I sort of was thinking about that, planning it, writing bits, and then kind of realized actually like I sort of worked backwards and I realized that we need something in the middle to kind of give us a sense of like who this person was. It can't just all be recollection. And then I think that started to reframe the story for me about the fact that it's not necessarily about death. It's a story about, for me, about like hope and life, and kind of the start of the story really is, like you said, two people coming together and deciding what their life is going to be. And then we kind of see how that unfurls through successive generations kind of experiences of it. So yeah, it was a bit weird. It sort of worked backwards. But I was sort of writing it sort of chronologically. It could kind of jump around, and it's got this sort of like prologue and epilogue structure as well, which kind of came a bit later. But I think it was just, yeah, trying to give, I suppose I'm quite interested in giving people like as little as possible. Like how many sort of glimpses and flashes can you get without it being annoying? But it still kind of pulls you along, because I think often that is the experience of life, especially when you might have moved continents or countries and people have died and you're just trying to grasp at what's actually gone on here, what's happened. So that kind of ended up being the best way I figured to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I think it comes to like what you said there about there being kind of absences in a family's history, especially with migration and leaving, like being the kind of grandchildren of the couple at the start of the book and trying to like piece things together. I think it works really well. This does lead me on to my next question, which is, as it's probably obvious, migration is a major theme in both of your novels, particularly the impact of migration on a family, and like the intergenerational impact. Do you think, first of all, that is a fair assessment of both of your novels, and why is this something that you wanted to explore? Is it something that you set out to explore, or that just kind of came up through your writing as you were doing it? Either one of you can start first.
Ammar, you go first.
Okay. I think, yeah, I mean, when I first started writing, just generally, in life as a journalist and kind of doing, I write music reviews and do like arts and culture features, but was always really drawn to identity. And I was always like, oh, that's interesting that I'm interested in identity and blah, blah. And then obviously realized that, like, oh, it's because I don't know what I'm doing. Like, who am I really? Like, what's my identity? All the usual stuff I think that people get if you've, parents have moved and you're born in a different country from them. So I think, yeah, it kind of it felt that the notion of like migration identity felt really central. Like if I was going to write something, it was definitely always going to be the first thing that kind of came up. And then, yeah, and then I guess that then brings with it questions of place. So just the idea of, there'll be a generation that decides to leave, probably because of like socioeconomic pressure, racism, colonialism, all of that stuff, and they have to go somewhere else, believing they can give their kids a better life. Those kids are then brought up somewhere they've not chosen to be in. They might resent that. And then their kids might be like fully assimilated and look at their grandparents move as like, God, like, why did you do that? Or not even care or not even know them. So, and that's obviously something I'd kind of experienced a bit in my family history. So I was, yeah, interested in how like place can like bear down on you. And then either you kind of leave or you get a bit crushed by that, or maybe you like assimilate, and how that then changes like who you are and the like successive strands of your family. And yeah, and then that always comes back to that question of like, who am I?
Yeah, I also thought about identity a lot when I was writing Paper Names, because I feel like, I mean, identity is so complicated. In some ways, it's always in flux, right? You're always changing, always evolving. And I felt like, especially in America, well, and in London too, it's such like a melting pot of different cultures. And a lot of times I felt like my identity was almost thrust upon me. Like I felt like people try to make my identity about where I was born, like who I was born to, what culture I was raised in, where I was raised, what values my parents had. And I think my struggle with that is that I feel like those are things I didn't choose, right? They were kind of like given to me by way of birth, like Ammar was saying, like decisions were made for me. And then that identity was placed on me. But I kind of look at those things now as my background, because I think that fundamentally your identity is based on the decisions you actively make, right? And so your identity can be because of or despite your background. I think that's something that, especially like children who kind of grew up in multiple cultures, kind of had to reckon with. Like, what parts of this culture is mine, and kind of what can I create for myself?
Yeah, I mean, I have another question on this for you. Maybe it's overlapping slightly with what you've both just said, but why was it important to you both to explore the perspectives of parents and children, particularly their identities and the expectations surrounding both of them after the moves that they've made, and how easy was it to get into the different headspaces of each of your characters? Maybe I'll go to Ammar first again.
Yeah, I mean, I guess parents just pour so much, at least my experience, like from a British Asian background and lots of people like that, it's very like kind of duty oriented, and kind of there is that clear like family blood is thicker than water thing. So parents pour like so much hope and expectation into their kids with that double-edged like thing of being like, you know, we want you to do as we would have done, except you're in a different place. Then if you decide to go off and do what you're going to do in this different place, then it creates a kind of bit of a problem. So yeah, I just think I was interested in that friction between feeling like a deep sense of loyalty to your parents, a kind of a respect for them and what they've been through, especially when it comes to like racism and prejudice and just having to hustle. But then also maybe feeling like a bit embarrassed. Your parents maybe feeling a bit embarrassed of their kids. Yeah, and kind of then how that push and pull, whether that ever gets resolved, whether you maybe only even think about that after they've died. And I think in terms of how easy it was to get into, I guess I drew quite a lot on like my sort of witnessing of different generations for my family and also like friends' families, and just more generally, I guess writing for me sometimes is like I sit at this table where I am now, and I think about these people that I've made up, and I'm like, how can I make them cry? How can that happen? And then you just go from there. And that's kind of like, what are they doing to each other to make them upset? And then maybe laugh a bit as well afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, your novel does have funny moments, even if like with it being about a family's you know, the grief and kind of, yeah, I do remember like actually laughing aloud at some moments in your book. So I do think you balance that well. But yeah, Susie, is that kind of similar on your end?
Yeah, I really loved writing from the parent, Tony's point of view. I think his voice just came to me so easily. And maybe it was because I spent most of my life trying to understand my parents. Like Tony is not based on my dad or my mom specifically, but like kind of a small amalgamation and also, just like fiction. Um, but I just remember there was like one day when I was like probably annoyed at them for something. I just realized, oh my God, they exist outside of me. Like when they leave me or stop talking to me, they still just go on living their lives. Like they're totally fine without me. And it just made me realize like my dad is not just a dad, right? He's not just a father. He's like his own full human being. And he's been through so much before I came along. And I think like just in that, egotistical sense, I just always thought of him in relation to me. And as I kind of dug deeper into this character, sometimes like when I would get stuck or when I would feel like, oh, I know something's here, but I don't know what it is, I would actually just call my parents and we would like talk for like hours. And it made me realize there were so many questions I never asked them before that I just like either thought I knew or I just maybe I didn't want to know at certain points too, to kind of just like keep moving forward. And that's why I think like a lot of this book I feel like does hinge on like empathy and forgiveness. And nobody's perfect in this book, but nobody's perfect in real life, right? And um, I really just loved writing because I remember there were some chapters where like I felt like I started crying writing it, and like I remember in the back of my mind I was like, okay, this is good. I'm just gonna like channel this through to the reader, and hopefully they feel the same thing. And yeah, it was just such a lovely experience and probably brought me closer to my parents.
Yeah, have both of your, well, has family members of yours read your novels? Is that something that has happened?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Both my parents love it. But you know, the first time I told my mom what it was about, I feel like, you know, a lot of times when you write a book, you probably shouldn't tell most people what it's about because at best they'll be encouraging, which isn't even that helpful, but like usually they're actually like, oh, like good luck, you know, like that's yeah, interesting. But I remember when I told my mom finally what it was about, I was just submitting it to agents. And I was like, oh, it's about like a Chinese American family and they're finding their place in the world, you know, etc. And my mom just looked at me and she was like, who would want to read a book about that? And after it got sold, she was just like, I want to write my own book. And I just thought that switch was so interesting of like what she thought people would be interested in, like kind of dictated what she was going to do, you know?
Is that the same for you, Ammar? Have you had anyone read your book yet in your life?
Uh, None of well, my mum passed away, so it's just my dad, and I've got an older
Mm,
brother. No one's read it yet, partly because I've not encouraged them to that much.
yeah.
But yeah, I think they will read it. I think my dad liked the acknowledgements when he saw them because he's in them.
Hmm.
So that's nice. But I think it'll be interesting. There was like a whole running joke that the seed of the book was planted because I'd kind of talked about writing a memoir of my granddad's life, and then he passed away. So there's this kind of thing where everyone's like, "Oh, is it like that memoir book?" And I'm like, It's really different now." So I think it will
Hmm.
be, yeah, it will be interesting to see what they think. I guess people will be wanting to pick apart like what's real, like where am I in this book? But I'm very adamant that it's a complete work of fiction.
Also
I don't want
fiction.
anyone to sue me. So yeah, it's all fake.
Are you scared for your dad to read it? Are you a little nervous?
I think, yeah, I'm a little bit nervous, but I think generally yeah, I guess I just hope he likes it. I think it's always
Yeah.
interesting, isn't it? Like you just you bear your like experience. And so I think it will be probably quite confronting to read in some ways because you're a bit like, oh, I didn't know you observed that or thought about this that
Mhm.
way. But yeah, I'm sure they'll enjoy it when they do finally get around to it.
Okay, I'm going to go back to book related questions now instead of interrogating you about your families. My last question was kind of on the theme of expectation. I also wanted to explore or talk about the expectations surrounding place within your books. Your characters who decide to migrate um, do have like big dreams of what their lives are going to be like in the places they choose to go to. So, like the UK and the US. They make a lot of sacrifices to make these new lives their reality. Do you think that part of the migrant experience is disillusionment and adjusting these expectations surrounding, like, the move? Either one of you can
Yeah.
go first. It's quite a heavy question.
Yeah.
I think for, oh, good.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I feel like um, my parents were definitely sold this idea of the American dream, you know, when they were coming here. And I feel like that dream is so aspirational, right? That people travel across air, land, sea to get to it. And I feel like all three characters in my book actually achieve a great measure of that dream. And what I found interesting is as I was writing them, it's like while they achieved sometimes the pinnacle of that dream, I felt that they were actually left more adrift and more unmoored than they had been originally. And I don't know, I just always think of the American dream as like people always say, oh, it's to build a better life, right? But it's like, what is that definition of a better life? Is it like white picket fence and 2.5 kids and a car? Um, I think like you have to really define it for yourself. And for me, the real dream of America is that it's a place where you could feel what you want, that you can love who you want, you can say what you want, you can believe in what you want, right? And that you can live the dream out that you want. And I think it's only by redefining that kind of conceit or the false promises of this dream that the characters are finally able to find peace.
Is
Mm.
that the same on your end, Amar?
Well, it's really interesting, I think, with the differences of like the American like
Yeah.
ideal, I guess. But yeah, it's fascinating. Like I think that you're right. Like you're definitely sold something. And I think, I mean, just from my family's experience, it was like the kind of British like empire like propaganda machine. So like I think even my dad, because he came over when he was like 7 or 8, and I think he remembers like believing that the streets were like paved with gold in certain bits, of London or whatever. So just stuff like that. And I think, yeah, so the disillusionment is definitely kind of quite integral, to kind of, I guess it's like the most brutal form of like education, that you kind of realize that you've kind of always been othered, being brought up in this sort of colonial system, and now you finally got to the place where everyone else is and you're still different. So then it's like you either assimilate or you kind of have to find your place elsewhere. So yeah, I think I was interesting exploring that, and kind of how place comes to bear, and how everyone, the context of what you're in as well, can make things difficult. Like I was quite interested in looking at like intra-racial tensions, or like how some of the like British Asian characters are like super racist, to other immigrant communities. So it festers all these different kind of complex relationships. And I think, yeah, often you can kind of lose yourself in that, as you're just constantly striving. You just want more than you've got there. You've assimilated, now your kids want more. Where does it kind of stop? I think that's also a question to kind of hold in mind.
I've sometimes heard of it as like this American dream or this British dream is kind of sold to force people to assimilate, right? It's like, so we kind of let go of like the culture we came from. And I feel like now we see a wave of going the other way, where people are kind of reclaiming their cultural stories and celebrating that. And I think that's, I mean, we see in the literary world even, right? It's like these stories are being told. And I feel like
Mm.
that's just such a wonderful development of this time.
Yeah, and to sort of celebrate it, I think, as well, isn't it? Such a
Yeah,
positive, nice thing to do, rather than just be like, oh God, like I'm ashamed of it or something, or
right.
knowing how to even talk about it. It feels very, very new.
Well, I mean, in both of your books, the younger generations of the family eventually do go back to the countries where, the countries of their heritage. Was that an important part of both of your books, like that you felt like you really needed to include that, and why did you want to include that, and what function do you think that kind of provides for your characters and for your story?
Yeah, I think there was, with mine, I think there's a sense of, these characters, well, some of them are born in India, but most of them spend their times outside of that country, but they're always viewed as Indian or South Asian. So it's something about this return to a homeland where actually it's not really theirs, or like they don't even fit in themselves. The locals know that they're from abroad. So I think I was interested in that, partly from my own experience of going back to India and doing like things like spreading, grandparents' ashes and seeing family. You sort of assume like, oh, I'm going to be welcomed with open arms, but actually they'll take one look at you and be like, we know you're from London. And you go, why? They go, well, I'd never wear jeans with rips in them. Like I'd throw them away. So it's like stuff like that. You're just like, it's so clear. So I think, yeah, that felt like it needed to happen in order to kind of unpick then the imagined identity that these characters like built over the years of like coming home, and they get there and it's like another disillusionment, even though that's the thing that everyone's telling you to do sometimes, is, go home. So it's kind of, yeah, it's like a double-edged sword.
I think for me, Tammy really did have to go back to China eventually, because I feel like when she was brought over to the States, her mom wanted her to assimilate so badly that it was like being white was really important. And there was a scene where she's trying on clothes, and her mom was like, "Oh my God, in that light, you look half white." Like and that's like a celebratory moment for the mom. And I feel like because of that, for so long, Tammy kind of shuns this identity, this Chinese part of her, to the point where like when people start calling her Chinese American, she's just like, why aren't I just American? Like, why do you have to add Chinese? Like, I don't add Chinese. I don't feel Chinese. I don't even, really know my country. And I think it's only at the end when she kind of embraces her whole identity, or tries to at least explore her whole identity. That's where she can more find herself and decide who she wants to be.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question just with my eye on the time, and then I'm going to go to questions in the chat in a second. So my last question is, what do you both hope that readers gain from your novels in terms of reading experience, or like was that something you were even thinking about when you were writing?
No, that's a hard question. I feel like it's oftentimes not helpful to think about the meaning of even what I'm writing while I'm writing it. I feel like for me, what I was able to take away from the novel is I think I often write, sorry, here's my dog. And I often write from a place of confusion, right? So if I see something happen where like someone hurt someone else and they just kind of walk away, I'm always like, why? Why did that happen? And I try to explore that kind of event in the book. And I think through doing that, I'm just able to forgive my characters and ultimately like other people in my life, and just kind of, so much of fiction is stepping into someone else's shoes and realizing that those people are as real as you are, right? Like as full of a human being as you are. And so I hope that this book causes people to kind of see the people in their lives a little differently.
Yeah, I think similar to Susie, I was like not thinking that much about reader experience, but I think when it was done, I guess just like empathy was really important. This idea that, everyone's unlikable and likable, and there's, you're not going to be like this perfect protagonist or something, or an antagonist. So I wanted people to kind of understand why some characters do the things they do, especially when you get that jump forward and you're like, oh, what's happened? And then to kind of, I guess, think about migration as something that people don't really ever choose. Often it's something that's kind of brought upon them. It's very politicized, especially in the UK right now. So I think it felt important to like humanize these people as not just being like capable of like perfect assimilation or like lovely diaspora poetry. It's like it's everything. And they're just, striving to survive and, look after themselves and be good people at the end of the day. So felt like yeah, if people take that away, that would be very nice.
Okay, I've seen some questions come in from the chat already, so I'm just gonna go straight in. The first one is it's for Ammar. The Emily loves the idea of choosing a particular day to tell the story. Was it always going to be told over a limited number of days? And how much of the time between the days did you plan?
Yes, so sorry, was it always going to be told over a limited number of days? Yeah, I guess like I was saying, there was that thing of I always wanted it to be set initially on that one day in 2019, the kind of like present day moment, and then I kind of worked backwards from that, and three just ended up being like just enough, I think, to kind of bring people through. And then in terms of time between, yeah, I guess there was like consideration with, it starts in the 50s. I wasn't like super interested in kind of having too much of one period, if that makes sense. I kind of wanted that jump to kind of, on the cusp of the 21st century and then kind of as close to the present as you could be. So that's kind of the way it came out, but they are quite sizable jumps in time, which I think was also kind of important to show that hopefully people live for quite a long time and families exist for quite a long time. So you do need to get in that sort of scope.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna go straight. There's a few questions now. I'm gonna go straight into the next one. Emily is always fascinated by novel names. What did both of you call your books while you were writing it? And did you always know what it would be called, or did it come to you later in the process?
So my book was actually, this is a paper name, is the second name I had for it, but I always knew the word names was going to be part of the title. I've always saw names as something that was really powerful, right? Like our first names, our family names, they really do make up so much of our identity, but they're kind of given to us kind of randomly. Sorry, this is my dog, Delta. This is the only way she won't bark. She just wants to be part of the Zoom. So yeah, we're given these names very randomly, Delta stop. But but we kind of use them to sign all the important papers. Sorry. Ammar, do you want to actually go to yours first? I'll just
Delta wants to be
control her for a
included.
second. Yeah,
Yeah, I was
go for
similar
it.
to you, Susie. Mine, A Person is a Prayer is the second title. I started off with this title, like and so much longing, because it was like this phrase that had just popped up, and longing was this kind of pivotal emotion I thought connected to lots of the kind of migrant experiences I'd had, that I'd heard of or experienced. This sort of longing for, an imagined past, a kind of more nostalgic past, longing for like a homeland, longing for an imagined future, this push and pull, and then actually the title came from one of the like epigraph quotes. I was like collecting all these quotes that I thought would be good to use to kind of set off the book without obviously realizing that you have to get copyright clearance for everything, which
Yeah.
costs a lot of money. Luckily, this one got cleared and actually worked really well. And the quote's like a person is a prayer through like his or her longing. And it just felt nice to have that kind of chopped and actually a bit more evocative to have that first part. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, another question from Natasha is, what was one of the most surprising things or facts you learned when researching your books?
Mm.
How much research did you even do, if a lot of it was kind of, came from personal experience?
I think for me, the most interesting thing was I did a lot of research into my scenes in China.
Yeah.
And I picked Dalian is the city that the Chinese family immigrates from. And I picked that because it was where my grandma grew up and lived her life. And I never knew until I started to go into the research that Dalian used to be under British rule and Russian rule and Japanese rule. And it kept getting traded hands because it was a port city. So actually, even today, when you go there, you see like Orthodox churches, you see like, there's like Russian domes. You see like different Japanese styling, like, and different characters in Japanese still etched into the walls. And I thought that was so interesting because I think when I think of China, I never really thought of it as other than like Hong Kong, like so dominated by Western rule. So just interesting kind of seeing the history of a city. And now it's back under Chinese rule and kind of seeing how, it's changed again.
Mm. That's really interesting. I didn't do like loads of research into my book. I mean, I spoke to a lot of, in fact, it was a lot of oral research. Actually, interestingly, I think it was like flora and fauna, because like setting it in different places, I was just like end up doing a lot of research into like
Mm.
what grows where. Sandalwood trees are very interesting and nice and kind of exist in only very specific parts of India. So that kind of forms a part of a bit of the book. So there was that kind of, I guess, rooting it in place. But I think because it's so embedded in like these characters' sort of interior monologue, um, luckily I didn't sort of have to do loads apart from just remembering like there's no iPhones in the 50s, stuff like that.
Um, Mo has asked, for both of you, did you experience any obstacles in your writing journey? And if so, how did you stay motivated to overcome them?
Yeah, I think for me, because I wrote it while I was at work, I actually really didn't hate my job as a banker. It was probably the most perfect corporate job I could have had because I was also a banker on future technologies like AI and virtual reality. So it was like kind of a storytelling embedded in that job. The hardest part actually is like when I started writing, I didn't think I was going to write a novel. I kind of just was writing and it just kind of turned into a novel. But there is a part where I felt like my identity was starting to split. Like I couldn't really stomach being a banker at some point because I was becoming more of a writer, but I still needed to keep that banking job. So I think that was a hard, I guess, part of my identity I had to really reckon with. Um, and I think the only way I could keep going was to feel like anytime I was too tired to write at night, I'd be like, well, if I don't write tonight, that's a whole nother day I'm away from not being a full-time writer. Like, so I can only control this part. So I just kind of like barreled ahead, I think that way, with some negative reinforcement.
What about you, Ammar?
Yeah, that's really impressive. I mean, it's kind of similarly, I had a full-time job when I was writing, and it was like partly carving out the time. And I think there is that sense sometimes that I had with first book that it's like it has its own momentum, like it's gonna come. So you're channeling that. So the actual writing, there were periods where like I wasn't writing because I didn't really know what to say, and then I was just leaving it for a bit too long. But then when I got back to it, it was always fine. I think it was more like when I was finished and I was like, oh my God, I did it. This is great. And then I was like, now what do I do? Like, how do I edit this? Like, who do I send it to? The kind of the reality of it. And then I think the kind of thinking about it as a piece of work, thinking about like themes, like what's it actually saying? I think that was really the hardest part, like really trying to work out like what is this book about? Is it just my like ramblings, or is it actually got something cohesive like running through it? So it was working on that kind of backwards that probably was, yeah, the toughest.
I mean, seeing how to sell the book is probably the hardest part, right? Like you write for months, for years, so much hard work, but it's like one of the only places where your hard work could just go into nothing. Like no one buys the book, and then like it doesn't get published, and you're just like, okay. So I think that's hard to like keep going, right?
Yeah, do you find it hard to work without like a clear end goal, I guess, like to stay motivated when there's no guarantee that it's gonna come to anything? Was that hard?
I think it's scary more, like especially now. I feel like Amar and I both left our full-time jobs. It was like our second book's better, get sold better, come to something. But sometimes I try to think of it as like all that pressure on the book is sometimes necessary. Like the pressure on you to make every sentence, every character, every chapter count. I feel it more intense than I had before.
Mm. And I think I guess you sort of have to, at least I have felt like I had to believe that something was
Yeah.
gonna happen. I think if I really sat with like, oh my God, like the stats and what's gonna happen, then I think would be difficult. But yeah, it's believing it. And then I think just the virtue of like, yeah, if you're putting down stuff every day or like regularly, you will definitely get to a point where you're like, oh, I've got like 40,000 words.
Mhm.
I can see now like towards the finish line. So that's always nice to know that you just have to just keep going and you will eventually get a draft, whether it's good or not, but then you've got something.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a combination of like initial delusion with then routine and
Mhm.
hard work, and then it eventually pays off and comes to something. Um, Amy has asked that, well, she said she loved the discussion around the American dream and family expectations. Do you consider yourself to fulfill these societal expectations? And is this something either of you have ever wanted to fulfill?
Good question. uh
I know it's like a heavy question.
no, I was saying I'm trying to think what are the expectations.
Well, have either of you ever felt expectations, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely felt expectations from my parents, and I feel like in some ways I probably did fulfill those first. It was like, I think, wanting to become a lawyer at first um, made my life feel easier. Like my parents were all happy, everybody was happy, I was going to be a lawyer. And then when I became a lawyer, it was also fine. And then when I quit that, my parents kind of had a heart attack and were just like, oh my God, because I quit to just travel through Europe. So I was like, I'm going to need to like find myself. And then when I came back and started doing banking, they were like, okay, it's totally fine now. Like she's back on track. And then when I told them I was starting to write again, they had their second heart attacks. But I think I almost like in some ways had to, not had to, but like, I think because I tried their way, it kind of freed me to be like, I don't ever wonder what my life could have been like in the corporate world. And I think sometimes people ask me like, do you wish you just like got an MFA or like went right into writing, things like that. And I always say no, because I think I needed each of those experiences to also really like value like my life now. Like, yeah, everything is hard, like money's hard, all these other expectations are now on me, but this is the life I've always dreamed of, like to be able to wake up, to write what I want to write, to teach, to like go on these cool events, and like every day doesn't look the same. I meet very different people now who all like dream for something, and they're not just all complaining about their jobs. Like, I think there's something really special in that. And had I not gone through that traditional track, I don't know if I could have really valued it the way I do now.
Mhm. I think, yeah, in terms of expectation, I guess the only word that jumps to mind is just like money. It always felt like that was the thing, like just make
Mm.
as much money as you can and just absolutely like just do that at all costs. So I've not fulfilled that yet. But I think, yeah, my sort of viewpoint of what I want to do is definitely, yeah, it's amazing to have, published a book. And I think ultimately it feels like now I just want to, this is cliche, but cliches are there for a reason. I just want to like be in the moment, like be a bit more present
Mm.
and just kind of like, enjoy things as they're happening, connect with my work and with like everyone around me and just like be open to kind of like the messiness of life and its surprises and all of that. And then hopefully one day I'll get really rich and then my dad will be happy.
The dream. No, those were two very inspirational answers. I think I'm going to make this the last question. So Nick has asked, was it difficult drawing on any particular personal experiences during the writing process? Do you have any advice for writing about difficult subject matter?
I think whenever I had to write about a difficult subject matter, mostly when it came to Tony and Tammy's relationship, there's a lot of love there, but there is, physical abuse. Um, I just think you have to lean into it. It was actually easier for me to write from the parent's point of view than the child's, because maybe like I connected, or I was worried people would connect me more with the kid, or I don't know, there was almost like a small block there. But I felt like the only way I could do is just to be very honest about it. And one method that kind of helps me when I'm on block with a character is um like I write as if the character is in a therapy session, and the therapist is being like, well, why don't you want to talk about that? And the character just has to keep responding. Like, it's obviously none of it it's going to go into the chapter, but it's kind of like helping you excavate that character into saying the thing that the character doesn't want to tell you, or that you can't see yet. And I think it's really just being honest with yourself of where you're holding back, and then just digging as far as you can.
Mm. Yeah, that's really, really good and kind of similar to what I would say in the sense of I think the difficult stuff was there's a lot of like writing about grief and loss, I think, in my book, and that spoke to like my experience of my mum dying. And I think there was an element of that being kind of quite nice and cathartic because I was like, oh, these things I haven't thought about. And then you hit that, yeah, that level of like, I'm not actually getting to the messy stuff. And then that, yeah, portioning it out, kind of just working and being kind to yourself, I guess, is the other thing that like can be really heavy. Um, if even if you're writing a fictional story, which we both have done, you're drawing on personal experience. So it's like important to take breaks, be kind to yourself, because if you want to do it, I guess, well, you do need to go to the tough places, and then that can take a bit of like calming down or like aftercare even after that. Yeah.
Well, thank you both for such like thoughtful answers. I'm now going to ask you to pick your favorite question out of the chat ones that I asked you. I mean, you can both pick a favorite one if you would like. Maybe they're the same.
Oh, this is difficult. They're all so good.
I I'm gonna choose Amy's American Dream one because it was personal and difficult.
Mhm.
Yeah, I was
Well, it
gonna
was
choose that
interesting.
one, but I also really liked paperback Mo's question
Okay, well,
about experiencing any obstacles in your writing journey and how to overcome
They're
them.
all really good. Thank you everyone for tuning in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, I found the questions really like everyone was really engaged in the conversation, which was nice. But yeah, so with Amy and Paperback Mo, if they want to get in touch with me with their addresses, and we will send out 2 copies of the book to them. But yeah, thank you so much to everyone for joining us tonight, and thank you to Susie and Ammar for showing up and being so willing to answer all the questions, and for your great readings as well. Actually, hopefully that's given everyone some insight into the novels, and you'll all go away and read them. Yeah.
Thank you, Jenna.
Thank you.
Thank you for moderating.
Yeah.
It was such a fun event.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to end the event now, but thank you so much. Okay, goodbye, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.